Understanding XenApp 6.5's new server and policy settings. All right, so in that last nugget, I promised you a list of all the new policies so that you don't have to go and poke through to figure out what's new and what isn't. I'm going to deliver that list to you here in just a minute. I put it together in a nice Excel spreadsheet so you can just kind of see what's new and what you need to pay attention to. And then also of the policies that exist, well, I want to focus you in on some specifically that are somewhat different than what you may be used to. Many of the new policies are just further extension into the types of settings that people want. So many of them, they just kind of make a lot of sense just right out of the box. Some of them do not. Before we get there, however, there is a server setting called Dynamic Data Center Provisioning. I talked about it 2 nuggets ago in the first nugget in this series. It is it's just a very wildly named feature for what little you have to do to turn it on. Dynamic Data Center Provisioning is essentially splitting apart your XenApp servers into the haves and the have-nots. So in Dynamic Data Center Provisioning, we have the ability of setting up a server as a worker or a controller, more or less. And a session-only XenApp server, one that is just merely a worker, not a controller, cannot perform any of the extra tasks that Citrix requires in order to kind of manage the cohesiveness of the farm. It cannot be a data collector. It cannot participate or trigger zone elections. It doesn't run the XML service. Web interface cannot use it to enumerate applications. Interesting. Also, your App Center and PowerShell cannot use that server to execute management commands. So, all right, well, what can it do? Well, it's designed just to host sessions. That's what it's there for. So you think about this. In a small environment, you got 3 servers. You don't really care. These activities don't require a lot of resources, but you got 3,000 servers split across multiple different zones, multiple different geographic locations. Well, the activities here can be, somewhat aggressive for resources. In fact, if you remember back in the original 20 Nugget series, I talked about in the very large environments, there is the need, as you get larger, to dedicate a XenApp server to do nothing but zone data collection work and Citrix work. Well, what Dynamic Data Center Provisioning does is it allows just one more step of splitting apart those haves and have-nots. In fact, it is done, it is configured in one and only one location, and that is right as you are building the XenApp server from the role wizard, when you add new XenApp roles. So when I'm going through building a new XenApp server, here under the data collection item or tab, whatever, are these 2 options here called Enable Controller and Session Host Modes, or just Session Host Mode only. Now mine is grayed out here. I don't have the option because this is the first server in a farm. And the first server in a farm obviously has to have has to perform the controller activities. The farm doesn't exist. So you don't have an option when you are just creating a farm for selecting these 2. Once you start adding servers into the farm, well, then those options become available. Now, as you think about it, separating these out actually makes a lot of sense. You have some servers that you just want to focus on giving sessions, and then you have other servers that you might want to operate as almost beachhead servers for the different zones and different geographic locations you may have. If I have 3 zones here, if I have my Denver zone, and then I have my Las Vegas zone here, and I have my Omaha zone right here, right? And I want these to participate with each other. Well, I might want to set one server that operates as a controller in each zone to just perform those activities. Or in a very large environment, maybe even 2 servers. And then everybody else, we're just going to make those a worker. Again, you either are going to use this because you have a very large environment, or you are not going to use this because you don't. And if you do not have existing problems with zones right now, or with the activities, the Citrix activities of the data collection, stuff like that, impacting your host servers, don't even worry about it. Don't focus on this unless you're a very large environment. What most of us are here for in this nugget is not so much the dynamic data center provisioning feature, but what are all the new policies in Citrix XenApp 6.5. So I've taken that list and broken it apart by those in the user configuration and in the computer configuration. These are just the ones that are net new. Okay, these are the ones that are, when you look at where they're relevant, it says relevant to XenApp 6.5 only. I haven't dug any further into specific policies to, validate that every policy has the exact same settings that it did previously. I just haven't done that. But these are the net new policies. Okay, there's a number of them that relate to flash redirection. I now have the ability to throttle USB devices, which is just another piece of that whole HDX stuff. I have HDX media stream acceleration. I can throttle those as well. If you recall back from the original 20 Nuggets series, we talked about bandwidth limits and limit percents for how you would adjust how much bandwidth these different features have. If I'm using VM hosted apps, this is a function of a Xen desktop. I have the ability to turn on read-only client drive access. I have the linger and pre-launch settings here. I've got some extra color compression for still images. I talked about dynamic Windows preview, which has to do with pulling those arrow experiences, those Windows arrow experiences into the stream. I have power and capacity management, just a couple of things here that allow me to identify what the farm name and the workload name is for power and capacity management if you're still using it. And then down here are assigning load evaluators to servers, and then this last one, reboot schedule randomization interval. I'll talk about this in a second. Now you might be saying, Greg, you missed a couple because, well, I did that on purpose. So there are a couple of these in here that are worth actually taking a look at. Multi-stream, the multi-port policy, and then the multi-stream policy on computers. So a connection between a desktop and a server, right, occurs via there's some network connection between the client and the XenApp server. Now, this little connection here is obviously going to be of some width to it. But at the same time, there are different features that are occurring when you're making that connection between client and server that maybe you have different requirements on those features. Right? If I'm plugging in a soft phone into my session, I want that soft phone to have priority over other stuff, because if it doesn't have priority, then I end up with that nasty Venetian effect, where the sound is really bad in the soft phone. In the network world, we think of this as quality of service, and I can apply quality of service rules to my connections at the Cisco layer to say, all right, well, if you're this protocol, well, U protocol get priority over U protocol, and there you go. The problem is that QoS works at a certain layer of the network stack where it can see, in many cases, ICA traffic, which is the traffic that connects client to server, but it might not necessarily be able to see into the ICA traffic, the individual channels inside that ICA traffic. Now, built into the ICA protocol are a number of different virtual channels, and those different virtual channels each support one of the different feature sets, like the clipboard redirection and the printer redirection and the USB redirection and the recorder for your soft phone, so on and so forth. Well, the multi-stream and the multi-port policies that you're creating here are designed to split apart those connections and then apply policies so that you can make certain feature sets have different priorities than other feature sets. It kind of looks like this. So let me go over here to computer and take a look at the policy here under settings. And what I'm looking for is ICA multi-stream connections. Now, the first thing to do is to just simply turn on multi-stream. Okay, this first and foremost allows you to, or splits apart the traffic in a way that allows you to apply these policies to it. Once you've done that, then you can apply a policy to it. Okay, so here is the default port, here is the 3 additional ports that you apply policies to, and then what do you want to assign the priority for these ports to be? Now, I'm kind of purposely being a little bit vague here because which feature sets that you actually enable are going to be different, and you'll have to identify what these are based off of what you need. But I mainly just want to make you aware that these multi-port policies and multi-stream capabilities now exist in the protocol. And if you turn them on and set what you want your policy to be through these policies here, you can do so either for the server, or you can also go over here for the users and do so over here as well under ICA multi-stream connections here. So this allows me to, again, set it up so that certain types of feature sets are going to end up with a higher priority as the network travels than others. Classic case here is IP phones, but others exist. Now, a number of these additional features, I mean, here under user, under ICA bandwidth, we've got a couple of new ones here, client USB device redirection bandwidth limit. I mean, my guess is that you can probably figure out what these are. Under Adobe Flash delivery, we now have a couple of additional pieces that relate to Flash redirection. What's the color list? Do we support backwards compatibility? What is the Flash default behavior? Do I accelerate it or not? Or do I even block Flash? And then do I also want to turn on intelligent failback here, which says, all right, well, do I want to automatically revert back to the server-side rendering for Flash as opposed to the client-side rendering whenever there's a poor experience that might happen at the client side? There may be some cases, and it may be with certain Flash applications and in certain use cases, depending on where the user is, that actually pushing Flash out to the client, having it render out there, just simply does not perform very well. So here, failback when I don't think it's going to perform very well. Let me just introduce over here under ICA graphics, which is actually on the computer side. ICA graphics includes the new, let's see, where did it go? Here. Dynamic Windows Preview. Okay. As I mentioned, this is the arrow functionality. In Flip 3D, that's the Alt-Tab stuff. Arrow Peak, which is your shake your mouse thing. All of those you can now pull into the session. And the last one I want to talk about, because the other ones, again, are fairly self-explanatory. The one that may not necessarily be is under Server Settings, Reboot Behavior. So we've known for years that it's a really good idea to reboot XenApp servers from time to time because they're workstations, right? There's a bunch of people that are using a bunch of applications, and the applications are constantly spinning up and spinning down. And as a consequence, rebooting our servers from time to time just clears out all the cobwebs out of that experience. And in fact, there have been a number of these reboot settings that have been in here for a very long time. So in 6.0, we introduced quite a few of them. In 6.5, we now add in this additional feature, which adds a randomization interval when the reboots occur. So I can set, as you can see down here, the scheduled time, and then add in that randomization interval, some plus minus interval, so that I don't end up rebooting all the machines all at the same time. Now, what do I care? Right? If I've got a bunch of machines, well, I need to get them rebooted. Well, what benefit does that get me? Well, in the physical world, this is probably not a big deal, right? Rebooting machines in the physical world involves a bunch of physical machines. However, rebooting those in the virtual world as virtualized XenApp servers is a completely different story. If you set up an effective time of reboot without some kind of randomization interval, all of your machines are going to reboot at that specific scheduled time. And the reboot process is the single most resource-intensive process for a virtual machine. If you're limited on IOPS, what your IOPS are between your server and your storage, well, the process to just simply reboot your XenApp servers, if you don't have them randomized, can consume an inordinate amount of time. Right? You ever try to reboot every VM on a host at the same time? It takes a really long time. So this randomization interval is really handy for those situations when you have virtualized XenApp servers. and it meshes with, so that the settings here mesh with all the other settings. So do I want to kick off the users? Do I want to warn them? And so on and so forth. So these are really kind of the really important new settings you need to be aware of. Again, if under server settings, I have the ability to set up a new load evaluator to this. Under power and capacity management, I have the ability to set up a farm name and a workload name, so I can just assign that stuff. But those are really, again, kind of all the different settings that you need to be conscious of, or the policies that you need to be conscious of here in 6.5. A couple of really important ones, a couple of less important ones as well. So what have we talked about in this nugget? We've really talked about the whole notion of server settings, and specifically this dynamic data center provisioning setting, and then also the policy settings that are new to 6.5. We spent some time talking about dynamic data center provisioning and the use case where it actually makes sense. Right? If you're a small environment, don't sweat it. If you're a large environment, you might actually pay attention to it. Talked about how there are the haves and now the have-nots as it relates to XenApp servers. And this is a good thing, because you want to eliminate those extra resource-intensive activities from occurring. And then we spent a really good amount of time there talking about the new 6.5 policies, listing them out and explaining the important ones so that you're aware of what you're about to be working with. Coming up next, we will be working on Desktop Director, which if you played with it in Xen Desktop, you probably appreciate the new functions that it provides for your help desk. It gives them the ability to see kind of what the performance is and what the behaviors have been on a user's virtual desktop. Well, Desktop Director now in 6.5 gets pulled into the XenApp world so that we can pay attention to sessions as well as desktops. And that will be the topic of our next nugget. But until then, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.